And thank you for joining us this morning. So I'm here to talk about a project that I've been working on for the last couple of years. I'm an urban wildlife biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And one of my duties is to study wildlife in our cities and learn more about them. So a lot of times when I tell people that I'm like an urban wildlife biologist or I talk about urban ecology and things like that, people are kind of like, why? There aren't, because a lot of people just don't realize that there are so many critters that are out there in cities. Um, and so, people often are confused, why we're talking about cities and wildlife at the same time, because most people just have that association of wildlife being not in cities, right? So this is a map that I like to use. This is just a satellite image of Earth at night. And this really just, all the cities, this is like what we look like from space. And you can I like this picture because you can very clearly see how much land we occupy, right? We take up a lot of space. We take up a lot of space, and so there's not much area that we can really say here in the United States that is untouched by people. And so what this means is, like it or not, wildlife is going to have to get used to people. Like, this is something that they have to adapt to. So one perspective of looking at this is there's a naturalist by the name of Doug Tallamy. He's written a few books. His most recent one is called Nature's Best Hope. And with that book, he's really pushing the idea of using native landscaping, kind of like rewilding our yards, because in the United States, over 40 million acres is devoted to people's lawns. And to put that in perspective, in the lower 48 states, there's about 50 million acres of national park. So he's kind of using that idea of, in the aggregate, all of our lawns, how we choose to manage them really shapes the landscape of our communities and our country. And so he's got this idea, this effort known as Homegrown National Park, to kind of focus on how can we improve our cities better? How can we improve our cities to make them better for wildlife? In Texas, we tend to think of ourselves as being this like wild rural state, but the reality is the population of Texas has been majority urban since the 1950s or 60s. And today, over 85% of Texans live in urban areas. And it is most densely concentrated in the DFW to San Antonio to Houston area. This area is known as the Texas Triangle Mega Region, and it is expected, this is like one of the biggest kind of mega regions out there and one of the fastest growing. It's expected to double in the next 40 years. The urban population of Texas will. So this is not something that's going to change. And this is a lot of land area. The DFW Metroplex alone is larger than the state of Connecticut, so our changes that we see happening in our landscape as things get developed is not happening on a small scale. It's a pretty big area that we're talking about. And because so many people live in cities, it's important that the folks who live in cities have the opportunity to experience nature and interact with nature. So, what is an urban ecosystem? So urban ecosystems are a thing, and they're still functioning ecosystems. They just operate under a different set of constraints than a more natural, unaltered ecosystem. So when you have an urban ecosystem, and I use the term urban very broadly here. So urban is also inclusive of suburban in this case. One of the biggest and most obvious things, of course, is habitat fragmentation, where we have chunks of natural land that get broken up into smaller tracts of land that are used for different purposes. So some of it will turn into a house, some of it might be a school, some of it might be a street, some of it might be a park, some of it might be undeveloped open space. But you go from one piece of land that's being managed in one similar way to smaller pieces of land that are managed in different ways. We also tend to have altered habitat conditions in cities. So we have things like our soil structure has been changed. Water quality tends to be a little bit different due to modifications to streams and increased impervious cover, which means we have more runoff with more pollutants and things getting into the water. Invasive species are also a big problem in urban areas. Invasive species are everywhere, but they're tend to be a little bit more abundant in urban areas because there's just more opportunity for disruption, which means more opportunity for them to become established. So an invasive species, if you're not familiar with that term, that is a species, a living thing that is not naturally found in an area, that causes harm either to the environment, the economy, or human health. We also deal with the urban heat island effect. We felt this a lot this summer. I really wanted to try and make cookies on my dashboard with my kids this summer, but I never somehow got around to it. But I've heard that, it was hot enough if it's 110 degrees outside to bake cookies in your car. But anyway, the urban heat island effect is basically all of our built environment, all of our concrete and our asphalt. It is really good at retaining heat, and if you've ever stepped on pavement in August, then you know that it's hot, right? It'll burn your feet. And so it retains heat. It gets really hot when the sun's shining on it, but it also doesn't let that heat go at night. So cities tend to be hotter than the surrounding undeveloped areas. And that can lead to a lot of different issues for people and also for the environment. We also have changes to our disturbance regime. So we used to have historic disturbances that shaped our ecosystems. So things like flooding, periodically occurring wildfires, and herds of migrating bison. And we don't really have those things either at all or in the same capacity as we used to. And so that changes what species can be found at a location. We also don't have large predators in our cities, and also supplemental feeding can be an issue as well. So in spite of all of these things, though, there is a lot of diversity in our cities. So so this is iNaturalist. This is a citizen science website, and there's also an app you can get for your phone where people go and they document various living things that they see. So for the Dallas-Fort Worth area, over almost 11,000 species have been documented just in our area. So there is a tremendous amount of biodiversity here in our city. Here in our cities. It's just a matter of taking the time to look for it. So why should we care? Okay, we have cities, we have people in our cities, we also have wildlife in the cities. Why does it matter? Why do we want to know more about the wildlife in our cities? So wildlife and natural areas provide a lot of benefits, a lot of ecosystem services to our cities that humans benefit from. So some things are pollination, pest control, right? Coyotes, bobcats, hawks, all those things are really good at eating rodents, which we don't want in our houses. Snakes. People don't like snakes. They're also good pest control. But did you know that snakes can also help with seed dispersal? That's kind of a crazy thing to think about, but snakes eat rodents. Rodents eat seeds, and there's actually been research done that shows that when the snake has eaten the rodent and digested it, that any seeds that were like maybe, that the rodent had eaten that were not digested yet are still viable when they come out of the snakes. So snakes can help plant new plants. Isn't that cool? Natural areas, natural vegetation is also tremendously helpful to water quality. And there's, I don't even know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of research articles that show that having access to wildlife and nature is extremely beneficial to human health and well-being, both our physical and our mental health. It's also important to have natural areas and wildlife to provide recreation opportunities. And there's also tremendous economic benefits that come with having healthy wildlife populations in your community. So in an effort to learn more about wildlife in cities, the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago started the Urban Wildlife Information Network, which is a global study to learn more about wildlife in cities. And that's the project that we're really here to talk about today. So this started several years ago. And here's a map. All of these little black pins show you where cities are currently participating. So as you can see, with it starting in Chicago, as you would expect, most of the locations are in the United States and Canada. But they really want to expand this out to become more of a true global area. And so within the last year-ish, they've added Mexico City, I believe this is Cape Town, a city in Madagascar, and 2 cities in Germany as well. So hopefully we'll have more international partners that are participating in this effort. So this is the largest urban wildlife study of its kind ever. We've never had, so many researchers from different places collaborating on the same effort at the same time. And it's a really powerful tool to learn more about how wildlife survives and thrives in cities. So what is the value of having multiple cities participate? So if you have just one city participating, so for example, my study that I'm working with that has just a single transect in Fort Worth, some things that I can learn from that if I were to analyze the data is, I could maybe make some guesses as to how patch size, how big an area is, how developed the area around it is, what type of green space is it, how many people are there nearby. I could look at those things and I could make, conclusions about how those variables are impacting the species that can be found at that particular site. But I can't say anything about how it might work somewhere else, right? So if you're looking at between cities, so if you have 2 different cities participating, so in this example, we're using Chicago and Indianapolis. And these cities, they're not that far apart, so they're in relatively the same ecoregion, but Chicago is much smaller and much more densely populated. So you have a smaller land area, but a lot more people compared to Indianapolis. So you can look at things like, well, right off the bat, how is this more dense population going to impact biodiversity, right? So when you're comparing between cities, you can look at, you know, the percent available habitat. How does that influence things? Maybe your cultural attitudes. There's probably some cultural differences between Chicago and Indianapolis, right? And also things that were like historically used, how those properties were historically used. You can also compare between regions. So for example, if you were comparing Seattle to Phoenix, those are completely different environments, right? You know, you've got a very temperate environment versus a desert. And so now you can look at things like how climate impacts things, and how, you know, well, if you're in a desert environment, maybe there's a bigger impact of development compared to a more forested environment. There's just larger things that you can make assumptions about. So only cities that are kind of, that have, the more cities that you have participating across the globe, the more scales you can answer these questions at. So how are we doing this? Right now, UN, the Urban Wildlife Information Network, is focused primarily on using game cameras or camera traps, you'll hear them called. So the cameras are, each city has to have at least 25 cameras out. Some have quite a bit more. But at least like one transect with 25, a minimum of 25 cameras. And there's some rules about spacing and stuff like that. And there's also a database, and this is what's really cool, is there's a database where everyone researching can upload their photos, and they go in and they tag the photos to say what's in the photos. And then that information can be accessed by anyone who's a member of the network and wanting to do research on this. So game cameras are a great tool because they're pretty, for a study like this, because they're pretty low maintenance compared to other things. They're also passive, meaning that you don't have to like disturb the animal to do this, you know. They're motion triggered, so basically an animal walks in front of it and it takes a picture. It's not like a trap where you have to physically get your hands on the animal or something like that. But they do have their limitations. So for example, camera traps are really only suitable for large to mid-sized mammals, you know. Like a rabbit or a squirrel is about the smallest critter that you can get a picture of that you can identify. We do get pictures of mice and rats, but you just can't identify them without really having them in hand. So that's a pretty limited taxonomic group, right? We get lots of pictures of birds as well, but a game camera is not a good way to sample birds. So the birds are really just more of like an incidental sighting. So the folks at UN do want to expand beyond just camera traps. And so one of the things that they're working on that's really starting to gain some traction is using audio monitors. So this is a little sound recording device that you can put out called an audio moth, and you can just hang it up and, you know, set it out and leave it, and that will record sounds. And so this is a much better, more effective way of sampling birds. It could also be used to potentially sample other critters like amphibians, like frogs that are calling. And there are, but not necessarily the best for amphibians. But there are some other teams that are looking at what would be an efficient way to sample, you know, other amphibians and reptiles in cities, or even like small mammals like rodents, because those are just a little bit harder, a little bit more labor intensive to study because you kind of have to get your hands on them. So talk a little bit about my project here in DFW. So I began this project in April of 2021. I have 25 cameras that I have set up along the Texas 199 corridor in Tarrant and Parker counties. And the way that it works is, so everyone who's a part of this network follows the same protocols as far as when the cameras are set out and how the cameras are set. And there's quarterly sampling in January, April, July, and October. And during those times, cameras are set for 4 weeks. So you set them for 4 weeks, and then at the 2-week mark, you go and check them, make sure that the camera's still functioning. You take out the SD card to download any photos that you have, and then you lock it back up, and then come back in 2 weeks, and then you remove the camera. One key component of the Urban Wildlife Information Network study design is to have your camera set up along an urban to rural gradient. So that way you have some that are in very densely developed areas in your community and some that are in not developed areas, and kind of having an equal balance of that to look at how that influences the species that are present along that gradient. So this is a map showing my camera locations and the varying habitats along that. So red is developed area. So like the darker red, the more developed you can see. And so I've got quite a few that are in developed areas, and then quite a few that are in much less developed areas. So what do I find? I find a lot of the type of stuff that you would typically expect to see if you were to set out a camera, which is not surprising, right? We get a lot of the things that are common because these are things that are common. Lots of coyotes, lots of raccoons. It's kind of a fun picture of a raccoon looking up. You know, no one's really 100% sure what their black mask is for, but a lot of people suspect that it helps with light reflection, sort of like football players, they'll put the black under their eyes. But raccoons really have super sensitive paws that are have like way more nerve endings, and they have way more nerve endings in their paws than humans do in their hands. And so you may have seen before, like raccoons are kind of known for like washing their food before they eat it. And it's not because they want it to be clean. It's because when they get their hands wet, it makes those nerve endings more sensitive. And so they can learn more about what it is that they're about to eat. So they can almost sort of like see with their hands, they get so much detail. This is a striped skunk. So this is the most common skunk species that we have around. Skunks are usually pretty generous about giving you warning before they'll spray you. They'll stamp their feet and kind of like put on a whole show. Some will even turn around and do a handstand. Unfortunately, dogs do not interpret any of that as a warning signal, and it just makes them want to investigate further. This is the gray fox. This is one of our 3 fox species that is native to Texas. They are unique because they can climb up the sides of trees, sort of like a cat does. They're one of the only canid species that can do that. This is a bobcat. We also have lots of bobcats around DFW. A lot of people get confused by the tail because they think that bobcats don't have a tail, and they do. It can actually be 6 to 12 inches in length. And so sometimes people see a bobcat with its tail sticking up and they think that they've seen a mountain lion, but it's just a bobcat. We also get some species that we don't necessarily want to see that don't belong here, like feral hogs. This is kind of a funny picture that I got of a chicken that was obviously lost. July is a really fun time because that's when all of the babies are usually out and about. So sometimes you get some fun pictures of baby animals, like these coyote pups that are playing. Here's another picture of some coyote pups that are a little bit older. And then this is just kind of a cool picture. It's like a whole family of coyotes. Coyotes do live in packs. They are social animals, but they don't always travel in their groups during the day. So a lot of times like foraging and stuff like that is done independently. So you don't always see the whole pack of coyotes at once. You'll usually just see one at a time. Here are some baby deer that are hanging out in someone's front yard. Here's a mother grooming her fawn. And here's a raccoon with 4 or 5 babies. Raccoons, you see them around water a lot, and that's because their natural habitat is riparian areas. They're naturally found around streams and waters and stuff like that. So you can see they're fishing for some food right there. Here's another mama raccoon with a whole little line of babies following her. And here is a mother opossum with 2 little babies on her back. So you can see them. There's one right there going on that side, and here's another one right there, which is just so cute. And we don't really appreciate opossums enough. They are super weird animals, and they're very interesting. So opossums are the only marsupial species that we have in North America, essentially. And they are, so that means that they have a pouch for their babies. So unlike a kangaroo, kangaroos have horizontal pouches that their babies go in. Opossums have vertical pouches that their babies go in. And so when the babies are born, they're super underdeveloped. They're like maybe the size of like a bumblebee or something. And their first act is they have to beat out all of their siblings to make it into their mother's pouch, to attach to one of her nipples to get milk, before all of the space is taken up. And so they have a rough start to life, but once they make it inside the pouch, they'll stay there for a while. And then after they come out, they'll stay with mom, but they'll hang on her back, and so they'll get around from point A to point B by hanging on to their mother's back for a while before they go off on their own. And opossums, they're great to have around because they eat a lot of bugs and other stuff that we don't particularly like to have around. And they're also, they pretty much never get rabies because their body temperature is too low to grow the virus, essentially. So they don't get rabies, and they also are a little bit immune to snake venom. So anyway, they're very weird animals, very cool. We should appreciate them more. Sometimes I get pictures that are just, I was lucky to have a camera up. So I've got some snow pictures that are very fun to look at. So there's a coyote, here's a deer. This was in 2022, so this was last year. And then here's a picture from our most recent, kind of more like an ice storm. I just thought it was cool here how you can see how much the ice is weighing down those tree limbs. So birds, I'll talk about birds a little bit. Like I said, this study isn't really designed to record a whole lot of information about birds, but I do get some birds on cameras occasionally that are kind of fun. So here's a turkey, a wild turkey. Here's a roadrunner that's eating, it looks like a dragonfly. This is an eastern bluebird that is checking out this camera. And this photo is just taken seconds before disaster, before this poor little eastern phoebe flies into the camera. This, I'm not sure on the species of this one just because they're very difficult to tell apart. But this is either, so maybe if someone's on who's better than at birds than me, you might be able to tell. But this is either like a nightjar, this is some sort of nightjar, so it might be like a nighthawk or a whippoorwill or Chuck Will's widow or something like that. This little bird right here, this is a hooded warbler, which is just a species that's not super common in DFW. A migratory species that, you know, is only here briefly. And this is kind of cool because this is a fairly developed area that I took this picture in. I also get some other random critters. It's really hard to see in this one, but right here on this yucca plant, that is a little lizard checking stuff out. Here is another photo of a lizard. This is a Texas spiny lizard. And then I've got this kind of cool, this is a series of photos. I'll let it play. So if you look right here where the mouse is, you'll see something moving. And the crow is kind of checking it out as well. So that is a snake that's constricting, it's caught something and it's constricting its prey. I'll play it again so y'all can see. I'm not totally sure on this species, but that looks like a speckled king snake to me. So hopefully y'all can kind of see that. And the crow is just super interested, probably hoping it can, you know, get some of that snack for itself. I do get people on the camera sometimes. Usually it's just people, you know, minding their own business. Sometimes, you know, one of the questions I have is like, because most of my cameras are on public properties, they're in city parks, and I just kind of try to hide them as best as I can. One of the questions I get is like, well, how often do you have people like messing with your cameras? And I've only 3 times in 2 years have I had someone mess with the camera. And only 2 of those times was the camera destroyed. This time I had come up in the camera, so it has like a security cable attaching it to the tree, and then it has a cloth strap holding it on. And so the camera was like on the ground. They had taken off the cloth strap, but the security cable was still there. So they didn't get away with it. And so I was looking to see the photos that were on the camera, and I saw this. And at first I thought it was wire cutters. And I was like, oh wow, he had wire cutters, but he didn't like cut the cable and take the camera. And then I was walking away and I found this in a tree, and I realized that it was a little like homemade bong that he was using. I also got this picture, which I just think is so funny because this guy is poaching. He's at a city park that has a lot of deer in it, you know, at night when he obviously shouldn't be there with the rifle. And he just looked right at the camera. And so I just like to think what was going through his head at that moment. I also sometimes get, you know, interesting photos of animals, you know, doing interesting thing, or, you know, either doing something interesting or in an interesting condition. So this is a raccoon that has mange, a very bad case of mange. You can see it's pretty much lost all of its hair. Here's a coyote that has mange as well. And these kind of things are just kind of interesting because that could potentially like let me know if I start seeing a lot of animals that seem like they're in poor health, that there might be like an outbreak of something going on in that area. Here's some bucks that are sparring. Here is a raccoon that is eating a turtle. Turtles have a pretty good defense system built in with their shells, but raccoons have very dexterous little paws that can reach in there and scoop it out. Here is a raccoon that is not as happy. That's a snack for a coyote. And here's another picture of the same raccoon and the same coyote. So all of these pictures are really pretty like you know, this is very like common species, everyday stuff. You know, some of these pictures are kind of, you know, really fun to look at and exciting to see, but nothing that is like, you know, wow, like I can't believe there's a coyote here, you know, because we know that these species are abundant. But it is still important to collect information about common species because that can still inform our understanding of how those species use our cities and what benefits and what like land use practices benefit them. And also, you never know when these species are not going to be common anymore. So, for example, people of a certain age will tell you, oh, yeah, I remember when horned lizards used to be everywhere, or I remember when box turtles used to be everywhere. And we don't really have those critters everywhere anymore. So, collecting baseline data on common species is super important. However, I also occasionally get photos of species that are surprising to find and are not super common. So this picture right here, this little guy, this is a mink. This is an American mink. They are native to North Texas. So we have them here. They're just pretty elusive, sort of like, you know, sort of like otters. They're semi-aquatic, so they're typically only found near near water bodies, and they're just sensitive to development and they don't really like being around people. So they're just hard to find. And this picture was taken near the Fort Worth Zoo. So this is a pretty developed area, and there's also a little bit of snow on the ground when this picture was taken. So that was kind of surprised. That was just kind of a cool find because we don't really know you know, a lot of people aren't aware that mink are actually a native species to North Texas. This right here is the rarest species that I have gotten on camera. And this is an eastern spotted skunk. So this is a different species than the striped skunk that we were talking about earlier. And this is a species that it's not listed as threatened or endangered, but it is what we classify as a species of greatest conservation need, which means that its population is in decline, and it is in decline throughout its range, but it hasn't met that threshold of being listed as threatened or endangered yet. And the purpose of that classification is to hopefully identify species that need assistance and get assistance for them before they meet that level of needing to be listed at a state or federal level. Because once that happens, it's bad news for the species. And it's also just recovery is very difficult at that point. So anyway, the craziest thing about this is, if you remember, I said I started my project in April of 2021. This picture is taken on April 6th of 2021. So literally the first time that I went out to check the cameras, I got this picture. And this was one of the species that I was kind of like, I knew that they're in, you know, kind of like the outskirts of DFW. I was like, wow, it'd be really cool to get one of those. And I thought if I was ever lucky enough to get a picture of an eastern spotted skunk with one of my cameras, that it would probably be at like the Fort Worth Nature Center or one of the kind of rural private properties that I have my cameras on. But this picture is taken in downtown Fort Worth, which is the last place that I would expect to find a rare species that is sensitive to development like the eastern spotted skunk. And again, it was like right after I set the cameras, which is just crazy. So I shared this photo with a spotted skunk expert, and he said that this picture was taken during the peak of their breeding season, and males are known to disperse about 10 miles in a week during that time. So it's very likely that this guy was just passing through downtown Fort Worth. But isn't it really cool that there was just enough green space available for this guy to navigate all of that developed area, to use that space to get where it needed to go? So, same camera, 2 weeks later, I got this picture. Again, we're in downtown Fort Worth. This critter right here is known as a ringtail. People call them ringtail cats a lot, but they're not related to cats. They're actually in the same family as raccoons. And ringtails are, they are not like a species that's in decline like the spotted skunk is. It's just their population population distribution is much more common south and west of here. So they're doing much better in like Central Texas and further south from Central Texas. But they're just really unusual in North Texas. And another species that's kind of elusive that I would not expect to be hanging out in downtown Fort Worth. And so this was in April of 2021. In January of 2022, I got another picture of a ringtail at the same location. So that's at least 2 pictures of a ringtail hanging out in downtown Fort Worth. Again, where people would really not expect it to be. And so this, I think, really just highlights how even very small green spaces and urban areas can be extremely valuable to wildlife. So this is just a rough summary of what has been documented so far. Unsurprisingly, raccoons are the most common species, but one thing that I think is very interesting, the second most common is white-tailed deer. Even though white-tailed deer are only found in like half-ish of the locations that I have put cameras at. And so I just think that that's really kind of funny. The reason for that is, and you may have noticed this, is deer distribution in DFW is very spotty. Like there's either a lot of deer or there's no deer at all. And so in Fort Worth, if you start getting too far inside the 820 loop, you're not going to find deer anymore. But if you're kind of on the edge of the 820 loop, like near Lake Worth, or on the outside of the 820 loop, you're going to have a lot of deer. So for example, Azle, there's a ton of deer in Azle. And so it really just kind of depends on where you are. So just kind of an interesting thing there. And this just kind of gives you an idea of what species I'm picking up on my cameras. And so the whole purpose of all of this, like, yes, it's very fun to look at the pictures and stuff like that, but there's also been a lot of research that the Urban Wildlife Information Network has done on these, using the data. So these are some examples of some of the things that have been published. So things like how urbanization alters predator avoidance, and how community dynamics are influenced by green space and things like that. There was a study recently that recently published that the New York Times did an article on, that was looking at basically how biodiversity is impacted by development and things like that. So that's an interesting read. This is a list of things that the research that I'm doing in Fort Worth, some other researchers, so the data that I'm collecting in Fort Worth, this is some projects that other researchers in other areas are using our data in DFW to bolster their studies. So there's one looking at the impact of the urban heat island and artificial light at night on mammalian abundance. One's looking at predator-prey interactions. One's looking at coyotes and how urbanization impacts them in different cities. And another is looking at, there's a couple that are looking at kind of like biodiversity and how habitat connectivity influences species richness. And really the ultimate goal of this is to learn more about how wildlife uses urban areas and hopefully use that information to influence our land use practices so that we can find better ways in the future to coexist with wildlife in our cities, because it is so important for people to have access to wildlife. You know, like we all probably have a time where we saw a bobcat at the city park, or we saw a really cool bird in our yard or something like that. And those experiences stick with us. And they, you know, having nature in our cities also provides a lot of, you know, benefits to people in terms of having a healthy environment, and human health and economic benefits as well. So the goal of this project really is to learn more about wildlife so we can come up with solutions for the best, you know, best practices for getting people and wildlife to coexist together in cities. And with that, I will answer any questions that y'all have.
And if you guys would like, you can unmute, or you can always drop your question in the chat as well.
All right, I guess we don't have any questions. Quiet group today.
All right. Well, thank you, Miss Rachel, for presenting. That was very fun. I really enjoyed seeing all those different animals. Coyotes are probably one of my favorites, even though they're, yes, they're so cute. All righty, guys. Well, we will see you next month in person for our next Master Naturalist Presents. We'll be talking about the moon next month since it is our partial solar eclipse in October. Thank you guys for coming.